Have you ever heard the term land trust and you're wondering what is it and will it work for me? Well, in this video, we're going to break down what is a land trust and when would you use it. All right, let's get started. Okay, so a land trust is essentially a grantor trust. It's similar to a living trust. In the way it's set up, you have a grantor, the person who creates the trust. You have a trustee, the person who holds title to the assets. And then you have beneficiaries. Sounds a lot like your estate planning trust, but it's actually quite different in its form and function. But that is typically how we refer to it when we're dealing with third parties. That is, if they ask, what type of trust did you create? We're oftentimes going to refer to our land trust as a grantor trust. Now, one of the hallmark features of this title holding trust is that, generally speaking, outside the state of Florida, the land trust does not offer any asset protection. It has a very specific purpose in its use for real estate investors. That is, generally, it is set up to minimize transfer taxes or avoid due on sale clauses, as we're going to get into in this video. So let me just show you right now how a land trust is set up, who the parties are in creating your land trust. Okay, so say I'm an individual investor and I have an investment property right here. And I would like to put that property into a limited liability company. But in order to move this property into an LLC, I possibly have some issues that I may be facing when I deed that property in to the company name. Namely speaking, that if I were to transfer it into the LLC, there could be a mortgage on the property with an acceleration clause. An acceleration clause means that if title is transferred from my name, because I was the borrower, into this LLC, and a lender discovers that, they could then call my note due and force me to refinance at potentially a much higher interest rate. So that's a concern when you transfer property directly into an LLC. Now, there are exceptions to this. If your property is held by Freddie or Fannie, you can transfer the loan is held by Freddie or Fannie, you can transfer the property into an LLC without any concern for that acceleration clause because their underwriting guidelines permit this transfer. So that's an issue for people. How do I get property into an LLC if my mortgage is not owned by Freddie or Fannie without risking the acceleration clause? Now, another issue that comes up has to do with transfer taxes. That is, if I transfer property from my name into an LLC for asset protection, then potentially I can have the property reassessed for property tax purposes, meaning I'm going to now be taxed on a much higher fair market value than what it's currently pegged at, or just moving the property in like you have in Pennsylvania and in Florida, they will tax that transfer, that move. You'll have to pay a transfer tax. So these are some concerns that real estate investors have as well, is they want the asset protection of the LLC, but in order to obtain it, that there may be a transfer tax issue there. And so then you balance the cost. You think, well, maybe I'll just cross my fingers and hope that nothing ever happens. So one of the solutions that we have is this land trust. As I stated earlier, it's a grantor trust. And like a living trust, it's pretty straightforward in its application and its setup. So the first thing I want you to realize is that unlike a limited liability company, a land trust is a private document. Okay, so that means that this trust is not recorded anywhere. You create the trust or you hire someone like Anderson to create it for you. And so we set this document up, and the only people that know the terms of the trust would be the people that signed the trusted document and the people who drafted the trust document. So when the trust is set up, it's set up in a very specific manner. That is, unlike a living trust, wherein the assets that you put inside of the living trust, you as the beneficiary, you don't have the ability to transfer your trust to someone else. Like think about it like a corporation. In corporation, you own stock. Let's say I own stock in Microsoft. If I wanted to transfer that stock to my children, I would just give them the stock, assign the stock over to them. In your living trust, if you wanted to transfer the trust, you don't necessarily transfer the trust. What you do is you die, and then the assets transfer via the terms of the trust. So it operates a little different because in a land trust, the beneficiaries have the ability to transfer their interests. And this is important when thinking about this trust, that you can transfer your interests, because it means that whatever the trust owns, All right, so if you put something into this box, such as a piece of property, then if I want to move that property, I no longer have to deed the property in order to transfer it. All I have to do is move the box, right? So if I move the land trust to my child, that's why I wanted to transfer it to, then I would just transfer the box to him, and now he becomes the owner of the box. And if he owns the box, then he owns also whatever is inside of that box. So that's what's unique about the land trust as opposed to a living trust, is that it has this characteristic of the ability to transfer the ownership interest in the box to a third party. So the other thing about the land trust is that it's typically set up as a title holding trust. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, it's designed to hold title to real estate. That's its primary purpose. Unlike a living trust that's designed to hold title to real estate, it's also designed to bypass probate when you pass away and then transfer those assets on to your beneficiaries in specified manner. With a land trust, we're not setting them up that way. We're setting the land trust up merely to hold title to your property. So you take it out of your name and you put it into the trust name, as I'll be sharing with you, so that you're no longer listed on title to that property. It is the trust that now holds title to the property. So unlike you who could pass away and then the assets would be held in your name and go through the probate process, with a land trust, trusts don't die. We can set them up so that they continue on. And so it's used to keep title held in this trust, and wherever the trust goes, so goes the property, as I talked about earlier with transferring to your children and using that as an example. But as real estate investors, that's not how we're typically going to use this tool. What we're going to use it for is to make sure that we can then take a piece of property and get that property that is subject to a mortgage into an LLC without alerting the lenders to the fact there's been a property transfer. So herein lies the main benefit of using a land trust and why so many real estate investors use this, meaning if you're buying property subject to an existing mortgage and you don't want the seller's lender to know that the property has been transferred to someone else because you want to keep paying that mortgage at that lower interest rate, and you're not assuming it, but you're going to be paying it. And the risk is that the lender discovered that the seller had sold you the property, then they would call the note due. So people will use a land trust to minimize that risk, because by having the seller put the property into the trust, the lender looks at that, they make an assumption that the trust was set up for estate planning reasons, and they don't know that the seller actually moved you the trust, that you're the beneficiary, because again, the trust is a private document. Another example on moving the properties, as I stated, if you had property here and you wanted to get into an LLC, you'll put it into a trust, and then you'll move your trust to a limited liability company for asset protection reasons, because the trust by itself does not provide any asset protection. So let's just draw this out then and show you what I'm referring to on the way this thing comes together. Okay, so I've created thousands of these trusts, tens of thousands of these trusts over 25 years. And the way we set them up for our clients was with a couple things in mind. One was the transfer issue, okay, that I discussed, that the client who wants to transfer property from their individual name into an LLC, but is plagued by debt or transfer taxes. So that was a scenario in which we would use these trusts. The other client reason why people wanted to do this is they just didn't want people to know that they are somehow associated with this property. They want to get it out of their name. They want invisibility. And so that's a reason where a land trust can provide some protection for you as well. How does it do that? Well, it's in its setup. So when you set up a land trust, let's just call this the Green Bunny Trust. All right, so I create the Green Bunny Trust. Again, you come up with any name you want. It's not like an LLC where you have to check to see if the name's available. Because it's a private document, you're not going through the same process as you would with creating a limited liability company or a corporation. So I create the Green Bunny Trust. And when I create this trust, I have to list out some various individuals who were part of the trust. So a trust has to have a grantor. That is the person who creates it. And so if this individual down here, his name is Tim, if Tim was setting this trust up, we would list Tim as the grantor, the person who created the trust. Then in every trust, you have a trustee. Now here's where it gets a little interesting. So most people assume that when we're creating a trust, if I'm setting it up and I'm going to put my assets into it, I want to be that trustee. And that assumption is based on control because you've been conditioned to think that the trustee has complete control over the assets of the trust. Well, that is a legal fiction in the sense that when you set up a trust, it's like a contract. You can decide who has control over that trust. I can determine maybe the trustee has control over certain aspects of the trust, or I can decide that the beneficiary of the trust has the control. So when I'm setting up a land trust and I want to get the title out of my name, then in order to do this, I have to use a nominee trustee. Tim cannot be the trustee of his own land trust. And what do I mean by that? Let's assume we set up this trust and we said, Tim, you're the trustee, and Tim, you're the beneficiary, which means you're the owner of the trust. And if you own the trust, you own whatever you put inside of it. So if Tim transfers his property out of his name and places it into this trust right here, so now the property is held inside of the trust. Here's how the title would read if we were to deed this property into the trust. Title would move from Tim as an individual to Tim as trustee of the Green Bunny Trust. Okay, so if one of my stated goals in transferring this property beyond just avoiding the lenders noticing it's been moved into an entity, as I'm show you how that gets handled here, is anonymity. That is, so people don't know that I own this property any longer after I put it into the trust, and I can't use Tim as the trustee of his own trust. Because title, right, Tim's here, it's not protecting that. Now, if you're sitting thinking, well, why would I want anonymity? Why do I want to hide the fact that I own the property? Well, there's a lot of legitimate reasons to mask your ownership of real estate. One would be harassment from disgruntled tenants. Okay, that's a key one. I grew up and I experienced that firsthand, where when my father would go out of town, because he was a very hands-on landlord, tenants would call my mother and make disgusting comments on the phone in the middle of the night, tell them that they're going to come over, or he's going to come over and visit her because he knows my dad's out of town. And that was very emotional for my mother. So those are situations that can arise. If there's a potential creditor, and they're trying to determine, hey, does Tim have a lot of assets? Okay, why would I want to know that before I bring a claim against him? Because then I know how much pressure I can bring to bear. If I can't find any assets in his own name, then I'm pretty much relegated to collecting on the policy limits if it goes that far. And I'm not going to try to push for more if he doesn't have it, because then I'm just wasting legal resources. So we do it to protect it from that standpoint, to mask your ownership so people don't know what it is that you have. And there's other reasons as well that play out into this. But using anonymity in a land trust is a very important aspect of this overall property title holding vehicle. So when we set it up not with Tim as the trustee. We set it up with what we refer to as a nominee trustee. Now, oftentimes this will be an attorney. I've served on tens of thousands of trusts where I will be listed, it'll say Clint Coons Esquire as the trustee of the trust. So I tell people who look at title, property was transferred to Tim into Clint Coons Esquire. And so it tells them there's an attorney now serving as the trustee of this trust. Now, when Tim transfers a property to my name, Tim's obviously going to be a little unsure on that transfer initially, thinking, all right, what have I just done? I've placed the property in Clint's name as the trustee of my trust. Does that mean Clint can move into that property? Can he sell my investment property? Will he start collecting the rents on my investment property? Could he refinance it? Well, the answer to all those questions is a resounding no. Because when you set up the land trust, you specifically provide that the trustee does not have the ability to engage in any of those types of transactions with the assets inside of the trust. That all of those powers are reserved to the beneficiaries, which Tim is the sole beneficiary of his land trust because he owned the property. Now, if Tim was married, he and his wife would be the beneficiaries of this trust, and they would possess all this control. The only thing that we put inside of our land trust for Clint, what is he responsible for? Paying the property taxes. Okay, great. But that doesn't mean I'm going to pay my client's property taxes. I'm just responsible to use trust assets to pay property taxes. But I never find myself in that situation when I create a land trust for a client where I'm serving in this capacity as their initial nominee trustee. So when Tim transfers me title and we retitle the property from Tim to Clint Coons Esquire, trustee of the Green Bunny Trust, you see Tim's now off title. So if people look at the property, they don't know Tim's involved with it because they can't see the trust. All they see is Clint Coons. If somebody serves the trust, they're going to serve me as the trustee. They're not serving Tim individually, again, because his name is not disclosed anywhere. But as I hinted at, with being the trustee and having to pay the property taxes or deal with those, I never fall into that category or into that role, because when we set up a trust with a nominee trustee, the trustee resigns immediately once the client has signed the deed over to the trustee of the trust. So when our client signs the deed transferring the property from their name to my name as trustee of this trust, I immediately provide them my resignation. I stop, I quit. I don't want to be involved with your trust any longer because there's too much liability for me to stay on as trustee. I mean, you could be growing marijuana in that property and now I'm part of a dope growing operation. Not interested in being part of that, I can tell you that. In fact, that actually almost happened one time earlier on in my career. But there are a number of things, situations that could arise that I just don't want to get embroiled into. So I immediately resign my position. Now, when I resign my position, you have to have another trustee stepping up to take over control of this trust. Well, who is that person going to be? Well, I can only think of one person in my example. That's going to be Tim. Tim is the successor trustee who is listed in the trust document that will assume the trusteeship when Clint resigns. Now, for those of you skeptics out there that probably think, well, what's to stop Clint from staying on and not resigning? Well, if I did do that, as the beneficiary, you have more powers than I described. You have the power to remove me as your trustee as well if I chose not to resign. But that never happens because I want to bid off your trust right away. You now take over. Now, here's the thing. When I resign my position, that transition from me to you as the client or Tim, that's private. No one knows about this. So even though my name's still listed on title as in title, Clint Coons trustee of the Green Bunny Trust, they don't know that I resign. When I say they, any third party that's looking at title, they make an assumption that I am still involved with this trust. And I mean, personally, for my personal life, my cell phone, I've had to switch phone numbers because I've received so many text messages and phone calls on a daily basis from real estate investors who are looking at property. They're making the assumption that I own it. They skip trace me and they're calling me up and saying, hey, I want to talk to you about buying your property located at this place, Artibus Lane or downtown Seattle or in Wisconsin. I don't own these assets. Yes, I own a lot of real estate, but the assets that they can find that were my name's on, those are not my properties. We've done this so that we can mask or make my client invisible to these types of parties. In fact, I've been served before by attorneys who are bringing a claim against the asset itself. Maybe somebody slipped and fall, or maybe there was a loan that hadn't been repaid and they served me as a trustee. And then I dropped the bad news on them. You didn't have service or process on this trust. I am no longer the trustee. And then they want to know who is. I said, well, I can't tell you that because that's attorney-client privilege. And so this builds a barrier to third parties wanting to come after the asset because we've hidden from them who is the right person, who's in control. That person that's in control is the successor trustee, which is the owner of the trust. And so there's a lot of benefit in that privacy. Now, there's also protections that need to take place here as well. So when I resign my position as the trustee of this trust, I then provide Tim a trustee's deed. It's called a trustee's deed. And this is critical. Okay, I've worked with several investors that have used third parties to set up their land trust, even law firms set them up, not just the entity mills that are out there on the internet. And when they set them up and they're serving as a trustee, many times they don't resign. They stay on and they charge the client an annual fee to be the trustee. Now, there's no reason to have them on there. They don't need to serve in that capacity because when they resign, no one knows that they've resigned. They still get the anonymity. Or If you want them to resign, they want to charge you an additional upfront fee just for their resignation. And what they're doing is they're holding people hostage in a sense. And that in order for Tim to get his name onto the trust at some future point in time, such as if Tim wants to sell the property or he's going to refi it, you can't have my name listed there because title is going to look at it and say, well, where's Clint? Or the lender is going to say, well, who's Clint? You're Tim. We see Clint on title. And so even if you show them the trust document, title is not comfortable moving forwards with a transaction until Tim's name will appear there. So that's why you need to provide, or Tim needs to receive this trustee's deed that I assigned to him, transferring trusteeship to him upon my resignation. So Tim just takes that trustee's deed, puts it in his file, and when he's ready to get take my name off and put his name on, he records it. He records it at the county, and then all of a sudden the title the next day will no longer show Clint, it'll show Tim on there. Yes, he's lost the anonymity, but he's gained the control that he's seeking, so he has apparent authority to deal with title in either refining or selling that property. So this is how a land trust is set up. Once title is transferred into the trust, Tim's the beneficiary. We have anonymity built into it. But the problem, the one thing we don't have here with this overall transaction is asset protection. Okay? So what do I mean by that? Well, if something goes wrong with the trust, if all you did was set up this trust for your property, oh, by the way, if it's in Florida, you do have asset protection. So if you're thinking about setting one of these up in Florida, which is what we use a lot in Florida for our Florida clients who have investments there, then yes, it does provide asset protection. But outside of Florida, 49 other states, they don't protect the asset or the beneficiary. Meaning if something were to bring a claim against the trust, say the tenant's injured in some way or a guest of the tenant's injured on the property, they sue the Green Bunny Trust. Now the trustee, they're not liable, but they're going to sue the Green Bunny Trust, and then they're going to turn around and move for discovery, determine who is the beneficiary of the trust, and then they're going to bring the beneficiary in also as a defendant in the action. So this is a problem, right? If you put your property into a land trust, your reason why you're doing it beyond anonymity is that if you want to make sure that if something happens with the property, you have asset protection. And if all you do is stop at the trust and stop at the anonymity level, if a lawsuit does occur, you're not protected. So that's why you need to take the additional step of doing this. Once we have our property into our trust, and it's held inside of here, okay, then Tim, as the Benny, needs to transfer his ownership interest. It's called an assignment. Assignment of beneficial, I'll just call it BI, beneficial interest, to his limited liability company that he set up. So he wants to take this trust, this ownership interest, and in the trust document it states that the beneficiary can assign their ownership. So he's going to take his ownership and he's going to move it to the LLC. So another way to visualize this is to look at it like this. Here's your LLC right here, and here's your land trust right here, and the land trust owns the property. And then Tim is down here as the member of the LLC. Tim owns the LLC, LLC owns the trust owns the property. That's how it's set up. Now, before you start wondering, well, this looks really complicated and what does this do from a tax standpoint to me? The answer is nothing, okay? So the land trusts do not have to file tax returns. They're disregarded, they're ignored. You don't even have to get an EIN number for it. In fact, if you set up this structure and you ask me, hey, where do the rent payments go? I'd say just pay them directly to the LLC. You can ignore the trust's existence pretty much when you create this, with the exception of Florida, for property in 49 states. So this structure is designed to solve those problems that I outlined at the very beginning. If you have a mortgage on this property, you don't want the lender to know that you put it in the LLC, put it into a trust and put your trust into an LLC. If you're buying property subject to an existing mortgage, you definitely don't want the lender to know that this property's been transferred to you. So have the seller transfer it into a trust, and then you take the trust and you do with it what you need to at that point, from that point on. Other uses for using these trusts. If you have property, for example, many times we'll run into investors who have one LLC and they've put multiple properties into this one LLC. And one of the things that I'm a proponent of is to have one LLC per property until you get up to about 15 properties, and then you can start grouping them because you can take on more risk at that point in time. Meaning, if one lawsuit hit this property right here, then everything inside of that LLC is at risk because they sue the LLC, and all of the LLC's assets are now at risk. So when you hear about here's a better way to structure your assets, that is, rather than have 5 properties in one LLC, the best protection would be to create 5 limited liability companies like this, each with 1 property per LLC, as follows. Okay, and the idea being that if something went wrong with this property right here, then this is your only risk of loss. The other 4 properties are protected because they're in separate structures, unlike this problem that we had initially where all 5 properties were together, all 5 properties are just sharing their liabilities. So here's how a land trust can also benefit you. In this type of scenario, how do we plan? How do we set up, move from this type of structure to this type of plan over here without incurring a bunch of transfer fees and multiple deed filings and exposing the fact that we're involved in this overall structure? Because from a legal standpoint, if you wanted to move property from this LLC into these LLCs, the way you would do it is you would transfer it first to yourself and then from yourself back to the new LLC. So that is 2 deeds that must be recorded. One from the LLC to you and then from you back to the LLC. Now, why wouldn't you just move it from this LLC to this LLC? Because to do that, it'll probably result in a taxable event. Okay, so we have to make sure that these transfers are not resulting in a taxable event at the state or county level. So it will typically have to go from the LLC back to the owner and then from the owner to the new limited liability company. Now that's a lot of paperwork that has to be filed. So one particular use for a land trust is in this scenario, what we'll do is we'll create 5 separate trusts here, okay, for each property. And then we will move the properties, deed the properties into their respective trusts, move them into the trust. That is an exempt transfer from the LLC to the trust. Now, once they're in the trust name, right, the trust is not a public document. So people or somebody looks on title, they would say, oh, this LLC transferred title to this property to a trust, separate trust, not the same trust, all separate trusts. Then the trust is moved over to its respective LLC. Now, when we move the trust, remember assigning the beneficial interest like I said Tim did when he transferred his trust to the LLC? That's all hidden from public record because no one sees that. Those documents are not recorded. Those are your private documents. So what the land trust allows you to do is it gives you the flexibility now to take real estate that you've got too many properties in one LLC and you can move it to multiple LLCs. You only have one deed that has to be recorded into the trust, and then from then on, no one knows where that trust is held, because all of that information is private. In fact, moving forwards, maybe you start off with the trust here, and then in 10 years from now, you decide, you know what, I'm going to transfer this to my child because I want to reduce the value of my estate. So then you transfer your daughter the trust, and she then becomes a beneficiary. Now she owns the property via the trust. So the land trust is a very useful tool when it comes to avoiding transfer taxes, avoiding the due on sale clause or the acceleration clause like I referred to in the mortgage. And just generally speaking, it's one of those tools that every real estate investor needs to be aware of and understand when it should be utilized in their overall investing. The last thing I would tell you is this: hey, if you like to buy at auction, then you should become familiar with land trusts because they're a great tool to take title to properties at auction because it gives you flexibility then on where eventually that asset's going to go, and you can harden it with that LLC at a later date. So I hope you got a lot out of this video here. If you're new to land trusts, I wanted to give you some sense of when you should use this trust, what it looks like when you're setting it up, and some of its benefits. Take care.